Good evening, and welcome to this very exciting event. There are so many people to thank for their valuable contributions to this evening that it would take far too long to thank everyone. However, I must thank Eileen Makovic, Executive Director of the Illinois Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum, and her wonderful staff, Sonny Fisher, Chair of the Illinois Historic Preservation Agency, and of course John Simon and the members of the Illinois Supreme Court Historic Preservation Commission and staff, John Lupton and Matt Burns especially, and all of our generous sponsors here as well as the Retrial Committee in Chicago. I want to particularly thank the Springfield Committee, chaired so ably by Karen Hacera and Naomi Lynn. The committee embraced the idea from the get-go and did a really fantastic job. A special thank you goes to all those who have helped with the production of the Mary Surratt retrial. I would like to take this opportunity to introduce my colleagues who have joined us this evening and who had the vision to recommend and support the idea to have the Illinois Supreme Court Historic Preservation Commission created. Chief Justice Thomas Kilbride is here. Justice Lloyd Carmeier. And Justice Ann Burke, my co-chair for this evening. The law is a living, breathing entity. It reflected the values of the 19th century society and continues to reflect those values today. Ideally, the law treats everyone equally, and justice, the implementation of the law, is blind, favoring neither the prosecution nor the defense. At other times, though, justice is not only blind, but deaf, stubborn, frightened, and reactionary as well. This retrial is based on an actual historical episode. We always like to ponder, what if? What if the people who plotted the assassination of Abraham Lincoln and other top government officials had not killed the president? Or what if they had succeeded in killing not only the president, but Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward? What if Lincoln had directed the reconstruction of the South? And what if Mary Surratt, the woman who owned the boarding house where the assassination conspirators met, had been granted a civilian trial and was allowed to testify in her own defense? Mary Surratt was found guilty by a military tribunal in 1865 and hanged, becoming the first woman in U.S. history to be executed by the federal government. Would the outcome have been different if she had been allowed to testify in her own defense? Would she have lived to a ripe old age if the restrictive rules of evidence of a military tribunal were replaced with the proceedings in a civilian trial? Would Mary Surratt's fate have been different if she had had the top defense attorneys of the time defending her rather than a young, inexperienced attorney? We'll never know, of course. But tonight's retrial of Mary Surratt promises to be a great, entertaining journey into the land of what if. Now I would like to introduce my colleague, my co-chair, and my co-conspirator, Justice Ann Burke.
Thank you, Rita, my colleague, friend, and co-conspirator. The retrial of Mary Surratt has been developed from a new and solid collaboration between two state agencies combining the judiciary and the executive branches of government. We've brought in some of the finest legal and historical minds in Illinois today to plan and to implement this fascinating, entertaining, thought-provoking, and unpredictable journey from the past to the present. This retrial treads new cultural and educational ground. It provides a history lesson, a demonstration of top-notch legal strategy, a good dose of drama, and an excursion into the land of counterfactual history. The Mary Surratt retrial proves that Illinois is one state and that we are our best when we work together. The Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum, the Illinois Supreme Court Historic Preservation Commission, the working committees in both Chicago and Springfield, and the numerous layers, both on stage and behind the scenes, have crafted what you are about to see. We already have been considering that this retrial is a success because of this collaboration, and we look forward to our next project and collaboration. Have a good time.
Rich Bradley is considered the father of Illinois Public Radio Network. He spent 35 years with WUIS, WIPA, from the very first day it went on the air in 1975 until his retirement in 2009. He's covered presidential campaigns, state politics, and local government in Illinois for over 4 decades. In 2005, he was given the prestigious Leo C. Lee Award for his lasting commitment to public radio journalism and for the way in which he exemplifies the ideal spirit and passion of the profession. And now, live from inside the courtroom, Rich Bradley.
This is Rich Bradley reporting live from Washington, where the trial of Mary Surratt for her alleged involvement in the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln is in its last day. The final witness will be the defendant, Mary Surratt, and then the jury will hear closing arguments and decide her fate. The Civil War, considered the greatest legal and constitutional battle in America's history, has just ended. While visiting Ford's Theater, John Wilkes Booth learned of the president's plan to attend a play that night, and he quickly assembled his co-conspirators to take action. The assassination of President Abraham Lincoln at the height of his success by Booth on April 14th has jolted the nation from the euphoria of reunion to the horror of a failed attempt to bring down the government. The hysteria that surrounds the nation's capital has permeated every city and town and across the countryside. Booth was hunted down and killed on April 26th. By early July, a military commission had found 8 of Booth's co-conspirators, including Mary Surratt, guilty, and sentenced 4 of them, including Surratt, to death by hanging. John Surratt, also charged, remains at large. A last-minute reprieve allowed Mrs. Surratt to be tried again in a civilian court rather than a military tribunal. To bring you up to date on the retrial, the prosecution has completed its case. Prosecutors have called witnesses over several weeks to establish her involvement with Booth and the other conspirators. The most damaging testimony came from John Lloyd, Louis Weichman, and a War Department detective. Lloyd was Surratt's tenant at her Surrattsville farm and tavern. In March of 1865, he hid 2 guns in the tavern at the request of John Surratt. He testified that Surratt visited him twice, on April 11th and again on April 14th, to tell her to have the guns ready and to deliver a package from John Wilkes Booth containing binoculars. Booth picked them up from Lloyd on the night of the 14th after he shot the president during his escape to the south. Weichman was a resident at the Surratt boarding house in Washington. He testified that Surratt hosted Booth and other conspirators at her house to plan the kidnapping and later the murder of the president. Weichman confirmed that Surratt visited Lloyd on those 2 April days because he drove her there. He also noted that Surratt seemed very nervous on the night of the 14th. Also damaging to Surratt's case was the testimony of a War Department detective. He was at Surratt's boarding house to arrest her on April 17th, when Lewis Powell, who attempted to murder Secretary of State William Seward on April 14th showed up at her house. She claims she did not recognize him, although he had stayed at her house before. In her defense, Mary Surratt's attorneys have called several witnesses to show she was just a poor widow trying to make a living by running a boarding house. They testified that she had legitimate business in Surrattsville concerning some money owed to her. Witnesses testified to the fact that Weichman and Lloyd were both fearful of also being charged with conspiracy. Several Catholic priests testified under oath that Mary Surratt was a God-fearing, law-abiding woman who could be trusted. The entire world will be waiting to hear the jury's verdict. Was Mary Surratt the knowing keeper of the nest that hatched this horrible crime and assisted with Booth's escape, or was she simply an unsuspecting pawn in Booth's plot and therefore a victim of circumstance? It sounds like court is about ready to reconvene. We take you now to the courtroom where this trial is set to resume.
All rise. Hear ye, this district court is now in session. Judge Thomas Appleton presiding. God save the United States and this honorable court.
Please be seated. We are now reconvened in the case of the United States versus Ms. Mary Surratt. I would ask the guards to bring the prisoner into the courtroom.
Objection, Your Honor. May I be heard?
You may.
Your Honor, Mrs. Surratt poses no threat to this court. We ask that the military guards be removed.
I think your motion is well taken. We will excuse the armed guards. Thank you. Ms. Surratt, would you please raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
You may be seated. Mr. Harris, you may begin the examination of your client.
Thank you, Your Honor. Please state your name.
Mary Elizabeth Surratt.
May I call you Mary?
Yes, of course.
Tell us about yourself, Mary.
Well, I'm 42 years old. I was born in Prince George's County, Maryland, to the Archibald and Elizabeth Ann Jenkins, who were Episcopalian, but they sent me to be educated by the Sisters of Charity in Alexandria, Virginia. And at the age of 12, I converted to Catholicism, and I remain a devout Catholic to this day. When I was 17 years old, I married John Harrison Surratt. We had 3 children, Isaac, Elizabeth Susanna, whom I call Anna, and John Jr. We moved around some at first, but eventually we settled in a part of Maryland which became known as Surrattsville. We had a farmhouse there, and we converted part of it to a tavern. My husband was the tavern keeper, and he was also the postmaster.
What was your financial condition when you built the farmhouse?
Oh, we were quite comfortable at first. My husband owned a mill and several tracts of land, along with a house, small house, on H Street in Washington, D.C.
Did your financial condition change?
Yes, sir, it did. Unfortunately, my husband took to drinking, and he squandered many of our assets. When he died suddenly in 1862, I discovered that he had left us deeply in debt. I had to pull my children out of college.
How did you attempt to make ends meet?
Well, I thought I could make ends meet by renting out the tavern to Mr. John Lloyd and moving myself and my daughter Anna to the house on 8th Street in Washington, which I then converted to a boarding house.
Let's turn to the spring of 1865, when the time period that the government claims that you conspired with John Wilkes Booth, your son John, George Surratt, David Harold, and Lewis Powell to murder President Abraham Lincoln. Were you acquainted with all those individuals?
Yes, I was.
How old was your son John at that time, the spring of 1890?
He was 21 years old.
And where did he reside?
Well, he lived part-time in the country, and he stayed part of the time with us in the city, but never more than a week at a time.
When did you meet John Wilkes Booth?
I met him a few months before he assassinated the president.
And who introduced you to him?
My son. When John would come to visit, when John would come to stay at the boarding house, Mr. Booth would come to visit, and he chatted with me and Anna and the other visitors, the other tenants of the boarding house.
Was Booth a boarder himself?
Oh, no, he stayed at the National Hotel when he was in town.
And how did you find Booth as a person?
Well, I suppose much as any woman would have found him, he was very handsome. He was dashing and athletic, gentlemanly, very generous. Here I was, a poor widow running a boarding house, and here he was, the most famous actor in America, entertaining my family. He also knew something of our financial situation, and he was always eager to help. He was a very generous and kind man. I never did suppose that he had the devil he most certainly possessed in his heart.
Do you know if Booth was for or against the Union?
I don't know. He never spoke of politics with us.
Did you ever have any private conversations with Booth?
Oh, yes, I did.
What did you talk about?
Oh, we talked about many things, small talk, mostly. Mr. Booth told wonderful stories about his experiences in the theater.
Did you ever hear Booth discussing the plans to assassinate President Abraham Lincoln?
No, I did not.
Who introduced you to George Surratt?
My son.
And how did you know him?
I knew Mr. Surratt as a boarder, briefly, at the boarding house. However, I also discovered after a few nights that he kept alcohol in his room, and so I told my son that he couldn't stay with us anymore.
Did you ever hear Surratt discuss plans to assassinate or to shoot President Lincoln?
No, sir, I did not.
And who introduced you to David Harold?
My son.
How did you know him?
Mr. Harold was a visitor to the boarding house on occasion.
How often did he visit?
I didn't see him very often.
And how about Lewis Powell? Who introduced you to him?
My son.
And how did you know him?
Mr. Powell was also a boarder at the house, although I never knew him as Mr. Powell. The first time he came to board with us, he called himself Mr. Wood, or Reverend Wood, a Baptist preacher. He had a thick mustache, and he wore very fine clothes, and he entertained us by playing the piano.
Did you ever hear Powell discussing plans to assassinate President Lincoln?
No, I certainly did not.
Now, Mary, in the months leading up to the assassination, did you have an opportunity to observe the activities of these individuals at your boarding house?
Yes, I did somewhat, I would say.
And what did you observe?
Well, they were my son's business partners in his cotton speculation, so that's what they talked about, mostly, I assume. They laughed, they talked, they smoked, much as any other group of gentlemen would do.
Did you ever hear them individually or collectively discussing plans to shoot or assassinate President Lincoln?
No, sir, I did not.
Now, let's turn to the farmhouse. You said that your son, John, lived at the farmhouse during this period of time periodically. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And you heard the testimony of John Lloyd, and he testified, as you recall, that 5 to 6 weeks before the president was shot, your son John and Surratt and Harold brought 2 rifles to the farmhouse for Lloyd to hide for Booth. You recall that testimony?
Yes, I heard that testimony.
Did you know about those rifles?
No, sir, I did not.
Did anybody talk to you about those rifles?
No, never.
You'll also recall the testimony of Lloyd that he testified that on April the 11th, 3 days before the president was shot, that he had a conversation with you about those rifles, wherein you said, get those shooting irons ready. Someone would be by soon for them. You recall that testimony?
Yes, I heard Mr. Lloyd's testimony, but I never had that conversation with him.
Did you see Lloyd on April the 11th?
Yes, I did. I was on my way to Surrattsville on April 11th, and it just happened that Mr. Lloyd was on his way to Washington that same day, and we met, our buggies met, approximately at Uniontown.
And was there anyone with you at the time?
Yes, my tenant, Mr. Lewis Weichman, was with me at the time.
And who introduced you to Mr. Weichman?
My son. They were college students together.
And why had you asked Mr. Weichman to accompany you on this trip to Surrattsville?
Well, it's about a 2-hour drive to Surrattsville by buggy, and the roads are country roads and often deserted, desolate sometimes. And I don't see as well as I used to. It makes me nervous to drive a buggy by myself that far. So I like to have a gentleman accompany me when I'm going to Surrattsville, and Mr. Weichman happened to be available, and he was willing to accompany me that day.
Where did you acquire the buggy?
Well, I understand that Mr. Weichman got $10 from Mr. Booth. I had asked Mr. Weichman to go to Mr. Booth to borrow Mr. Booth's buggy, because Mr. Booth had lent me his buggy before to take it to Surrattsville. I had no buggy of my own. But as I understand Mr. Weichman's testimony earlier, he got to Mr. Booth, and Mr. Booth told him that he had sold the buggy, so he gave him $10 to rent a buggy instead.
I see. Now, when you saw Lloyd on April the 11th, I believe you testified near Uniontown,
Yes.
had you planned on seeing him that occasion?
Oh, no, it was just a chance encounter.
Did you have a conversation with him at that time?
Yes, we did, a brief conversation. We exchanged pleasantries, and he told me he was on his way to Washington, and then we said goodbye.
And how did Lloyd appear on that day?
Well, I'm sorry to say he appeared intoxicated, as he did most times when I've seen him.
Now, did you tell Lloyd on April the 11th to get the shooting irons ready, that somebody would be by for them?
No, sir, I did not.
Okay, you recall the testimony of Lloyd. He testified that 3 days later, on April the 14th, which is the day the president was shot, that he had another conversation with you, and that you told him on that day to get the shooting irons ready and 2 bottles of whiskey, that there would be some men coming by for them later. Do you recall that testimony?
I recall that testimony, but again, we had no such conversation.
He also testified that on that day you gave him a package containing field glasses that were wrapped in newspaper. Do you recall that testimony?
I recall that testimony.
Did
but
that
I
happen?
never gave him a package.
Did you see him on the 14th?
Yes, I did very briefly. I should state that I went to Surrattsville to collect on a debt that was owed to me by Mr. John Northey. In fact, that's the reason that I went on the 11th. I saw Mr. Northey briefly, but he did not pay me the debt. Then on the 14th, I received a letter from Mr. George Calvert, who was one of my husband's creditors. He demanded repayment and, well...
Let me show you Defendant's Exhibit Number 1. Is that the letter?
Oh, that is the letter.
And, Your Honor, would we move to admit this letter at this time and ask that it be published to the jury?
Objection?
None, Your Honor.
It may be published.
Thank you. Would you read the letter, please?
Certainly. April 12, 1865. During a late visit to the lower portion of the county, I ascertained of the willingness of Mr. Northey to settle with you, and desire to call your attention to the fact in urging the settlement of the claim of my late father's estate. However unpleasant, I must insist upon closing up this matter, as it is imperative in an early settlement of the estate which is necessary. You will, therefore, please inform me at your earliest convenience as to how and when you will be able to pay the balance remaining due on the land purchased by your late husband. I am, dear madam, yours respectfully, George H. Calvert, Jr.
And you received that letter on April the 14th?
Yes, I did, on the morning of April the 14th. So I felt compelled to go to Surrattsville once again to attempt to collect on that debt.
And did you go to Surrattsville?
I did.
Were you in the company of anyone else?
Yes, Mr. Weichman accompanied me again.
And what happened when you arrived at Surrattsville?
Well, we arrived at the tavern and discovered that Mr. Nauthy was gone. He had decided to spend the day in Marlborough. So Mr. Weichman wrote a letter on my behalf to Mr. Nauthy, and he gave it to Captain Bennett Gwynn, who delivered it to the Nauthy residence in the hopes that Mr. Nauthy would return before it was time for us to return to Washington.
Where did you see Lloyd?
We were just on our way out the door when Mr. Lloyd drove up. He had been at Marlborough also, and he had some fish and oysters, and he invited us to stay for dinner with him, but Mr. Weichman said that he had to return to Washington right away.
And how did Lloyd appear on this occasion?
Well, I'm sorry to say that once again he appeared very intoxicated.
Did you have a conversation with him beyond the oysters and dinner?
I did. We had a small spring bolt in the buggy that had broken, and I asked Mr. Lloyd if he would be able to repair it. Well, he did, to some extent. He took a small piece of rope, and he replaced the spring bolt with that rope, and allowed us to get back to Washington that way.
Did you say to Mr. Lloyd on April the 14th to get the shooting irons ready and also to have 2 bottles of whiskey ready for that evening?
No, sir, I did not.
Did you give to Mr. Lloyd a package containing field glasses?
No.
Did you get any field glasses from John Wilkes Booth that day?
No, sir.
Had you seen Booth that day?
I did see Mr. Booth that day. He stopped by at the boarding house just before we were to leave for Surrattsville to say goodbye, to say he was heading back to New York, leaving Washington, and to say it was a pleasure to meet my acquaintance.
Now, Mary, you were arrested on April the 17th at your house. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you were interviewed by the authorities at that time?
Yes, I was.
And during your interview, you were asked to identify someone who came to your door.
Yes.
Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that turned out to be Lewis Powell. Is that right?
That's correct. It turned out to be Mr. Powell, but I didn't know that at the time.
And tell us how you were asked to recognize Mr. Powell.
Well, we were being interviewed in the middle of the night. It was 11:30 or close to midnight. And the hallway was dim. And there was a knock at the door, and one of the officers went to answer it. And then he returned to the parlor to get me to identify the gentleman who stood at the door. Only he didn't look like a gentleman to me. He was dirty, covered in mud up to his knees. He had a sort of rag wrapped around his head, and he was clean shaven, and he held a pickaxe. He looked quite frightening. And I was already quite disoriented from being interviewed in the middle of the night. And as I've said before, my eyesight is not very good. And I simply did not recognize that it was Mr. Powell, whom, of course, I knew as Reverend Wood. Flashy dresser, very well dressed, a very polite gentleman, mustached and clean.
Had you invited Powell to your house that day?
No,
And was Powell a friend of your son?
he was a friend of John's.
Mary, a few final questions for you. Where is your son now?
Well, I haven't seen John Jr. since April 3rd, 1865. He came and had supper at the boarding house, and then he told Mr. Weichman that he was on his way to Canada. As far as I know, he's in Canada still.
Has he come to visit while you've been in prison?
No, sir, he's not.
Has he come to any of these proceedings?
No, he has not.
Mary, did you conspire with John Wilkes Booth to murder President Abraham Lincoln?
No, I certainly did not.
Did you conspire with your son John to assassinate the president?
No.
Did you conspire with anyone to harm President Lincoln in any way?
No, sir. I am just a widow trying to run a boarding house and make ends meet. I never conspired with anybody.
Thank you. No further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Mr. Davis, do you have any cross-examination?
Yes, thank you, Your Honor. Good evening, Mrs. Surratt. You are a Marylander, correct?
That's correct.
And you would consider yourself a good Southern woman?
Well, I would consider myself a good Marylander.
And as a Marylander, you consider yourself a Southerner, correct?
Well, I do, although I've often said that I felt the South acted too hastily in this whole business.
Perhaps hastily, but you still had sympathies for the rebel cause in the South, did you not?
Oh, I never pretend to express my feelings about politics.
Members of your family did, though, did they not, including your son, John Jr.?
Well, he was in cotton speculation.
Did you not know that he was also involved as a courier for the rebel cause?
No, sir, I did not know that.
Right. Well, Mrs. Surratt, I'm going to show you what's marked as People's Exhibit number 11 on the screen behind you, if you could look at that. This is a picture of your son, John, is it not?
That's John Jr., yes.
Now, speaking of your son, John, your other son, I believe you said his name is Isaac, he was also working for the rebels during the war, was he not?
Well, he was in the Texas Army, the Texas Cavalry, yes.
Which was part of the Confederate forces during the war.
That is correct, sir.
In many ways, your family did have great sympathies for the rebel cause in the war.
I guess you could say in some ways we did.
In fact, on one specific occasion, back on March 23rd, both you and your son John drove a Mrs. Slater out into the country, isn't that right?
Yes, I do recall that.
And she was a well-known blockade runner and dispatch bearer, wasn't she?
I didn't know that about her.
Now, when you came back to the city, you know what happened with you know where your son John and Mrs. Slater went that day, don't you?
Yes, I do. My son accompanied her to Richmond.
Which was the rebel capital, correct?
That's correct.
Now, when the federal investigators, we've talked a little bit about April the 17th, when they came to your boarding house that night, they searched your boarding house, didn't they?
Yes, they did.
And they found a number of photographs at your house, didn't they?
Yes, they did.
And some of very prominent rebel leaders, correct?
Yes, there were also Union generals.
Well, maybe not generals, but you did have a picture of Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederate States of America, did you not?
That's true. My daughter Anna had a photo of Jefferson Davis.
Well, let me show you what's marked as People's Exhibit number 42 on the screen behind you. This is the photograph that was found inside your home, was it not?
I believe so, yes.
And you also had a picture of Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederate States, at your home, did you not?
I believe Anna had a photo of Mr. Stephens as well.
And I'm going to show you what's already been admitted into evidence as People's Exhibit number 43. This is a photograph of Alexander Stephens, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
And it was the photo that you had at your home the night those federal investigators searched, is it not?
Yes, sir.
Now let us talk a little bit about that night, April 17th of '65. You were obviously home at your boarding house at that time.
Yes, I was.
And it was approximately 11:15 to 11:30 that the federal investigators arrived at your home.
That's correct.
Now I'm going to put up on the screen what's already been admitted as People's Exhibit number 6. This is a photograph of your boarding house, is it not?
Yes, it is.
And your boarding house is the smaller, lighter colored building on that, is it not?
That's correct, 541 H Street.
Now, were you expecting someone at that time that evening?
No, it certainly wasn't.
Well, you listened to the testimony of Major Smith earlier in this trial, did you not?
Yes, I did.
And when Major Smith came to the door and rang the bell, did you not shout out from one of the windows, "Is that you, Mr. Kirby?"
Yes, I do believe I did shout that out. Mr. Kirby is my brother-in-law, and he had visited us earlier that evening. I thought perhaps he had returned, forgotten something, and returned to get it.
Now, you opened the door to the investigators.
I did.
You let them in.
Yes, sir.
And when asked for Mrs. Surratt or Mary Surratt, you identified yourself.
Yes, I did.
And they asked if you were John Surratt Jr.'s mother.
Yes.
And you said, "That's me," or something like that.
Yes, sir.
And they informed you that they were there to arrest you and others in the boarding house.
Yes.
Now, while they were there, while they were doing the search that brought up these photographs, another individual came to the house that night, correct?
That's correct, Mr. Powell.
Now, you use the name Powell, but you also know him as Mr. Wood, correct?
Yes, I only know him as Mr. Wood. I found out subsequently that his name is actually Mr. Powell.
And he also goes by the name Lewis Payne.
I understand that to be true as well.
And you had met this Mr. Wood Powell Payne previously, correct?
Yes, I did, sir.
And in fact, he had stayed at your boarding house on an occasion.
Yes, sir.
Now, you claimed at that time and claim now that you did not recognize Mr. Wood Powell Payne, however you want to say it.
That's correct. I did not recognize him.
And you were approximately 3 paces from him when you were not able to identify him.
Yes, that's true.
And it's fair to say that we're approximately 3 paces right now.
Yes, I think so.
And in fact, not only did you say you didn't recognize him, but you raised your right hand and said, quote, "Before God, sir, I do not know this man, and have never seen him, and I did not hire him to dig the gutter for me." Did you not?
I'm sorry, could I have that quote again, please?
Your Honor, I would ask that Ms. McCork will be able to read back the last question.
Please do so.
And in fact, not only did you say you didn't recognize him, but you raised your right hand and said, quote, "Before God, sir, I did not know this man and have never seen him, and I did not hire him to dig the gutter for me." Did you not?
Yes, that sounds like what I said.
Now I'm going to put up on the screen what's already been introduced into evidence as People's Exhibit number 28. This is a picture of Mr. Payne, is it not?
Yes, it is.
And as you said before, you originally knew him as Mr. Wood, correct?
That's correct.
Now, you had met him on a number of occasions.
Yes, I had.
And in fact, on 2 separate occasions, he actually stayed at your boarding house.
Yes, he did.
One time was just for 1 night,
Yes,
and the other time was for, I believe, 3 nights.
I believe that's correct.
And the time that he stayed for 3 nights was towards the end of March, correct?
I believe that's correct.
Now, other than those 2 times he stayed at your boarding house, he frequently was at your home.
He may have been. I wouldn't say frequently.
Well, he was friends with your son John,
Yes, he was.
and he would come over to visit with John,
Yes.
and you had conversations with him on a number of occasions, correct?
Well, I imagine so.
Now, you claim that you did not recognize him that night, correct?
That's correct.
But did you not, upon meeting him, exclaim that he was a great-looking Baptist preacher?
Yes, I did say that, but as I say, on the 17th, he looked nothing like I had ever seen him before.
And this man who you were not able to identify that night, the man in this picture, he is, as the testimony is shown today, was the person who stabbed Secretary Seward on the night of the 14th.
I was shocked to hear that.
Now, we've talked a little bit about Mr. Payne. You also knew a number of these other people that were involved in this as friends of your son John, correct?
Yes, I did.
Including a David Harold.
Yes, I didn't know him as well.
But he frequently came to your boarding house.
He visited the boarding house a few times.
Now I'm going to show you now what's previously been introduced into evidence is People's Exhibit number 29. This is a photograph of Mr. Harold, is it not?
Yes, it is.
And this is a person who has been to your boarding house on a number of occasions prior to the president being assassinated.
Yes, that's true.
And having conversations with your son John
Yes.
and other individuals such as Mr. Payne.
Yes, sir.
You're also familiar with a man by the name of George Surratt.
Yes. We called him Port Tobacco because we couldn't pronounce his name.
Now I'm going to show you what's previously been introduced as People's Exhibit number 30. This is a photograph of Mr. Surratt, or Port Tobacco, is it not?
Yes, it is, sir.
Now this Mr. Surratt was there, I would guess, on more occasions than Mr. Harold.
Yes, that sounds correct.
In fact, he had been to the boarding house upwards of 15 times in the weeks preceding the assassination of the president.
Well, I couldn't attest to that.
A dozen?
Perhaps.
When he came to the boarding house, he asked for your son John.
Yes.
But when John wasn't there, he asked for you.
Yes, I imagine he did.
One time he actually stayed at your boarding house overnight, correct?
Yes, he did.
Now you're also familiar with a rather infamous individual by the name of John Wilkes Booth.
Yes, sir.
And you know him through your son John as well.
Yes, sir.
And I'm putting up on the screen now what's been previously introduced as People's Exhibit 31. This is a photograph of Mr. Booth, is it not?
Yes, it is.
And he, like the others, frequented your boarding house,
Yes, he was a visitor many times.
but he was never a boarder.
No.
But he was there constant.
He was there often.
There talking to your son John,
Yes.
possibly with Mr. Harold,
Yes.
with Mr. Surratt.
Yes.
And much like Mr. Surratt, when he came to the boarding house, he asked for your son John.
Yes.
And when he wasn't there, he asked for you.
Yes, that's correct.
And you, on occasion, had private conversations away from everybody else with him, correct?
Yes, we did.
Now let's talk about one of these occasions that you actually had a private conversation, specifically the day of April 14th. You had a private conversation with him on that day, correct?
Yes, I did.
And subsequent to that conversation, you went to Surrattsville.
Yes.
Now, you claim and you brought a letter from Mr. Calvert that it was in relation to this debt to Mr. Calvert.
Yes, it was.
And you intended to go down to Surrattsville to speak with Mr. Nothey.
Yes, that's correct.
And Mr. Weichman rented a buggy and drove you down to Surrattsville.
Yes, he did.
Now, this letter that we saw a little bit ago, you received that on the 14th?
Yes, I did, that morning.
And you claim that you were in such a rush to get down there, you immediately got the buggy and skirted off to Surrattsville.
Yes, I was alarmed by the tone of the letter.
Now, you've described yourself earlier as a devout Catholic,
Yes, sir.
a woman who honors the sacraments and the holy days.
Yes, sir.
Was not the 14th Good Friday?
Yes, it was.
And this debt that you owed to Mr. Calvert had been owed for many years.
Yes, it had been.
And the debt that Mr. Nothey had owed to you had been owed for upwards of 13 years.
Yes, that's true.
And yet it required such urgency on Good Friday.
Well, as I say, I was very alarmed by the letter.
Well, you went to Surrattsville to look for Mr. Nothey, correct?
Yes, I did.
But he wasn't there, was he?
No, he was not.
In fact, when you went to Surrattsville, you went straight to the tavern.
Yes.
Mr. Nothey does not live at the tavern, does he?
No, sir, he does not.
And yet you did not go to Mr. Nothey's house.
No, that's true.
And you spoke with Mr. Lloyd at the tavern that day?
I did as we were leaving.
And you contest that conversation as Mr. Lloyd testified to it?
Yes, I contest it.
You say that you did not ask about these shooting irons,
That's correct, I did not.
saying that they would be needed later that day.
That's correct.
You say that you did not give him a package of binoculars.
I did not.
And the question was asked about Mr. Lloyd's testimony. You also heard the testimony of Mr. Weichman,
Yes, I did.
who said that he saw you take a package from the buggy and take it into the tavern.
Yes, I had a package of papers for Mr. Nothey to sign. He may have been confused with those papers.
Well, didn't Mr. Weichman also testify that there were two packages, one of papers and one that you took into the tavern with
He
Mr.
may
Lloyd?
have.
Well, let's talk about the instance on the 11th when you were down in, I believe you met Mr. Lloyd in Unionville, correct?
Uniontown, yes.
Uniontown, okay. You also again contest that this conversation had anything to do with shooting irons.
Yes, I contest that.
You dispute that they had, you asked that these shooting irons be ready later that week or at any other time.
I never said that.
You made reference that in direct examination that on the 14th, Mr. Lloyd seemed intoxicated.
Yes, sir.
You never made any statement on direct examination that he was intoxicated on the 11th, did you?
Oh, I believe I did.
Mrs. Surratt, there's been a lot of testimony about debts and your properties. Would you consider yourself somewhat of a resourceful woman?
Well, I've had to be, yes.
Your husband passed away in 62?
1862, that's correct.
And between 1862 and 1864, you ran the tavern in Surrattsville pretty much by yourself.
Yes, that's true.
And had to manage mounting and increasing debt,
Yes, I did.
all while keeping a family together.
Yes, trying to.
And I believe in December of 64, you moved up to Washington to manage the boarding house.
Yes, it was November, December.
And you were able to get a lease with Mr. John Lloyd for the tavern in Surrattsville.
Yes, sir.
Now, Mrs. Surratt, you said on direct examination that your encounter, your conversation with Mr. Lloyd, I'm not sure if it was on the 11th or the 14th, was a chance encounter.
Yes, when he was driving to Washington and we met at Uniontown.
Let me ask you, Mrs. Surratt, was it a chance encounter to know David Harold?
Well, I suppose it was.
Was it a chance encounter to know George Atzerodt?
I suppose so, it could be.
And Mr. Booth?
Yes, sir.
And Mr. Payne or Powell or Wood or whatever you wish to call him?
Yes, sir, I didn't invite him into my life.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Your Honor. No further questions.
Thank you. We are now prepared to begin closing arguments. Ms. Bouquet?
Thank you, Your Honor. May it please the court, fellow counsel, Mary Surratt, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. These are difficult days. We are a nation that has been deeply divided over the issue of slavery. We have endured 4 long years of civil war, a terrible war that has seen brother against brother and family against family. None of us have been left untouched by this war, emotionally or monetarily. Fortunately, we have had the leadership of our able president, Abraham Lincoln. Even in the darkest hours of war, he has stood tall to lead us to an end. On April 9th of this year, he announced to a grateful and weary nation the end of our Civil War. We all, I know, were relieved and grateful. He had preserved our Union of the United States of America. I'm sure many of us believed that that would be the beginning of new prosperity and peace. Our lives would become again more normal, and we would look to Lincoln to lead us to heal the wounds of war. Incredibly, just 5 days later, our President Abraham Lincoln was shot. John Wilkes Booth fired the weapon at the Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., and hours later, our president was dead. We all know that John Wilkes Booth killed Abraham Lincoln. He pulled the trigger, he fired the weapon. He did it in plain view of the entire theater of people. What we also know now is that Booth did not act alone. Rather, he had the help of a group of closely knit conspirators, all of whom gathered together to plan this event, this tragic event in our history, to gather the necessary weapons, to plan for Booth's retreat. Sitting before you in this courtroom today is Mary Surratt. She has been charged with the conspiracy to commit the murder of our President Abraham Lincoln. You have heard from many witnesses in the course of this trial over the last several weeks, witnesses who have given you bits and pieces of information about this broad conspiracy that existed to bring down our nation. Soon you as jurors will have the opportunity to deliberate on the evidence that you have heard and to decide the guilt or innocence of Mary Surratt. You will be charged with the weighty responsibility of ensuring that justice is done. Let us take a few moments to look at the evidence, primarily of certain key witnesses, so that we can better understand the important role that Mary Surratt played in this conspiracy to kill our president. As His Honor will instruct you, a conspiracy occurs when two or more people come together to undertake a criminal act. They do it knowingly, they do it willingly. In this case, the something illegal was the murder of our president. Cold-blooded murder. John Wilkes Booth pulled the trigger. He fired the gun which mortally wounded Abraham Lincoln. But the assassination was the culmination of weeks of planning which we now know took place at a single location, the boarding house operated by the defendant, Mary Surratt. The conspiracy which led to Lincoln's death actually evolved over a period of time. We know now from the testimony which you have heard that the initial plan was to kidnap Lincoln, to hold him hostage. But as the Civil War ground to a halt in the late winter of this year, that plan took a deadly turn. Lincoln would not be kidnapped. He would be killed. The precise time and place for this kidnapping was not immediately determined. But as the various conspirators met in Mary's home and talked with Mary, talked with Booth, talked with Mary's son John, the plans were laid, the weapons were identified, and the escape route was planned. The conspirators waited for their opportunity. And that opportunity came on April 14th of this year when Booth happened to visit the Ford Theater in the morning. He learned at that time that Lincoln would be at the theater that evening to attend a play. Ford's Theater was Booth's home turf. He was a professional actor, and he had performed in many different plays at that theater. Only a month before, he had attended a performance in the theater, and he knew the theater owner well. This was to be his chance. We all know well what happened later that evening of April 14th. The president was shot and John Wilkes Booth escaped. All part of the plan that had been developed at Mary Surratt's house and with her help. Mary Surratt has testified before you today as the final witness in this case. She has told you that she knew nothing of this conspiracy. She has told you that she had no intention to harm the president in any way, that she had no thoughts of any harm to him. She has appeared before you as a meek person, perhaps a weak person. But I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that this has been a charade. Quite simply, Mary Surratt has lied to you. Why? Why, you ask, would Mary Surratt conspire to kill the president of our country? And how did she do it? Mary Surratt is not merely a Marylander with a fondness for the South. We know from the testimony of several other witnesses who have been before you in this trial that she had very strong feelings for the South. That in fact, before her husband died, they began operating their tavern in southern Maryland as a safe house for Confederates, for couriers, for spies who traveled back and forth between Richmond, Virginia, and points to the north and Canada, seeking aid and support for the Confederate cause. We know, too, by Mary's own admission, that her oldest son was a Confederate soldier. And though she denies any knowledge of her younger son's involvement in the war, we have come to learn that he, too, was a spy. How do we know that? By the testimony of his very own school roommate, Louis Weichmann. Louis Weichmann was a family friend of the Surratts. He had spent a great deal of time in and out of their home through the years, and in fact was one of the first residents to take a room in Mary's boarding house when she went to Washington in late 1964. But in the horror of the assassination of Lincoln and the serious wounding of our Secretary of State that very same night, on April 14th, Weichmann has had the courage to come forward and to tell us what he knows. That Mary, in fact, was a committed Confederate who wanted nothing more than to see the Union defeated. And I submit to you, she wanted Lincoln dead. When Mary went to Washington and converted her boarding house, or her home to a boarding house in late 1864, the house was conveniently located very close to Ford's Theater. Of course, she did not know at the time that this would end up being the venue for the president's death. She took in many boarders, and we now know from the testimony that several of those individuals have been implicated in the conspiracy to kill Abraham Lincoln. They included Mary's son, John Jr., who remains at large in Canada, a gentleman by the name of Lewis Powell, alias Payne, alias Wood, who we now know was responsible for the stabbing of our Secretary of State the very night of the assassination, David Harold, George Azarat. They were all part of that boarding house conspiracy. Fortunately, Louis Weichmann was a resident of that boarding house throughout the entire period of time that the conspiracy was hatched. And we now know through him a great deal about Mary and her involvement in the conspiracy. Let's quickly review what we know about her involvement. We know from her own testimony, as well as that of many others, that she frequently and regularly met with Booth. Those conversations were largely private, in whispers or behind closed doors. We know from Weichmann that he on occasion shared his own room with one or another of the conspirators, and that at least on one occasion he had the opportunity to view guns and knives on the bed of one of these conspirators in the boarding house. 3 days before the fateful assassination, we know that Mary asked Weichman to take her to Surrattsville. She said she needed to go to collect a debt to see a Mr. Nothe. We know, too, that on the way, she met or saw Mr. Lloyd. Lloyd was her tenant. John Lloyd was the gentleman who had agreed to take over the running of her tavern in Surrattsville and provide income to her. We know from Mr. Lloyd that Mary, on that fateful day, said, "Get ready. Have the guns ready." What guns? Guns that we now know were placed behind the walls of that tavern 1 month before by none other than Mary's son John. We also know that on April 14th, Mary made a second trip to Surrattsville, just 3 days later. We know that Mary used the excuse of another effort to collect a debt. This is that same debt from Mr. Nothe that we have heard was 13 years in the making. Where we have had no testimony here today that she made any effort to collect that debt before the 11th and 14th of April. And yet she had the urgency the afternoon of the 14th to go to Surrattsville for a second trip that week on this debt. Of course, Mr. Nothe was not there. But we do know that before she left to go to Surrattsville on that second trip on the 14th, she met with none other than John Wilkes Booth. They had a private conversation. He gave her a package wrapped in newspaper. She took that package to the tavern in Surrattsville and gave it to John Lloyd. That package contained field glasses. She told Lloyd this was the night. Have the guns ready, the guns that were hidden in the tavern, get some whiskey ready, have these binoculars ready. Why? Because she knew Lincoln was to be assassinated. Now, she has attempted to discredit Mr. Lloyd. She has told you that he was a drunk, couldn't be trusted. Every time she saw him, he was drunk. Well, let me explore that with you just for a moment, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Lloyd is the same man with whom she entered into a legal agreement to run her tavern. She relied on Mr. Lloyd for her living, for her income, at least in part, from the operations of the tavern. Why would she do that if she knew him to be irresponsible, unable to manage his affairs, if she knew him to be a falling down drunk? It makes no sense. Add to that the fact that when she was there on the 14th, she admits that she had a problem with her buggy. Who did she ask to fix it? I guess the falling down drunk, Mr. Lloyd. And indeed, he fixed her buggy, and she was on her way. What do we also know? We know from Weichman that on the way home, she was very tense. She was anxious to get home. Somebody was going to be coming. She needed to get back to her home. We know that Mary told Weichman on that trip back to Washington that Booth would be leaving Washington, that he would not be back, and that he had some identified great passion, which she did not discuss further. Lincoln was assassinated that night at 10:15. And within a very short time, Booth had made his escape from Washington, had gone to the tavern in Surrattsville, and recovered at least one of the guns that had been hidden with the tavern. We know that later in the night, the authorities came to see Mary, and Weichman was there when they knocked on the door. He heard Mary say to her daughter, Anna, "Let them in. I knew they would be coming to search." Why? Because that was the home where the conspiracy had been hatched. And finally, we know that 3 days later, when the authorities came to arrest Mary, Lewis Powell, or Payne, or Wood, showed up. The man that had been in her home a great many times, and she denied knowing him altogether. Why? Because he was part of that conspiracy, he had been implicated, and she wanted nothing to do with him. She said she didn't see well. She said the light was poor. But did she ask to get closer? Did she ask for better light? Absolutely not. She wanted more distance between them. She didn't want any recognition between them. And so she said, I've never seen him. My time to review with you the evidence in this case, the evidence of Mary Surratt's integral part of the conspiracy, is by rule limited. Following my closing argument to you, Mr. Beckett, her counsel, will have the opportunity to also speak with you and review with the evidence. It will be your duty to consider both sides. I have no doubt that Mr. Beckett will make a very splendid argument. He's a fine lawyer with great experience. And I have no doubt that he will call upon your sympathies as he seeks the acquittal of Mary Surratt. But I submit to you that all the sympathy in the world doesn't change the fact that our President Abraham Lincoln is dead. And all the sympathy in the world does not change the fact that Mary Surratt was an integral part of the conspiracy that led to that assassination and the subsequent escape of John Wilkes Booth. Booth may have pulled the trigger, but it was Mary who was the critical piece to provide for the conspiracy development and implementation. And it was Mary who was integral to Booth's escape from that theater. Mary Surratt did not pull the trigger of the gun that killed Lincoln, but her participation in the conspiracy was no less lethal. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she knew the intended result. I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, that this woman wanted Abraham Lincoln dead. I ask that you find what the evidence establishes beyond a reasonable doubt, that Mary is guilty of conspiracy to assassinate President Abraham Lincoln. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Beckett?
Your Honor, counsel, Mary. Mary Surratt is innocent. Restore her to her family. The government talks to you of the terrors of war. Well, for the lawyer as well as the soldier, there is an equally pleasant duty, an equally imperative command. That command and that duty is owed to Mary Surratt. Who stands before you innocent. The government tells you there was a conspiracy, and indeed there was. There was a conspiracy of John Wilkes Booth. There was a conspiracy of Lewis Powell. There was a conspiracy of George Surratt. There was a conspiracy of David Harold. That conspiracy was executed on the night of April 14th, 1865, when President Lincoln was shot, when Andrew Johnson was to be assassinated, and where Secretary of State Seward was viciously attacked and stabbed. The government has also included in that conspiracy John Surratt, Jr. But Mary Surratt was not part of that conspiracy. Judge Appleton will instruct you that a conspiracy is a criminal agreement, and that for Mary Surratt to be guilty, she must have criminal intent. Mary Surratt was not a conspirator, and Mary Surratt had no criminal intent. Many people helped John Wilkes Booth. He sent telegrams. He bought horses. He rented horses. He bought guns. He bought spurs. He bought knives. He stayed in the National Hotel every time he was in Washington, D.C. Man after man helped him. But they were not conspirators because they intended no criminal purpose. And they did not know Booth's criminal purpose. So too it was with Mary Surratt. Mary was not a party to any criminal agreement. Any act that Mary did to help Booth or his co-conspirators in any way was an act that she would do for all, an innocent act that we all do in our day-to-day human existence. Boarders need a place to stay. Boarders need something to eat. Boarders need a place to keep their property. And when they stay, they have friends who come and visit them. Boarders pay for the privilege of doing these things. And every boarder at the Surratt boarding house paid their regular boarding fees to stay there. Indeed, the manager of the National Hotel, where the conspirators met many times, is not a conspirator. Nor is the bartender at the National Hotel, where the conspirators met many times. And neither is Mary Surratt. Well, what does the government claim in the proof supports this idea that Mary was a conspirator and wanted to see, as the prosecutor said, President Lincoln dead? Well, they claim that she knew all the conspirators. They claim she went to Surrattsville on April 11th and April 14th. They claim that John Lloyd talked to her of guns and whiskey, shooting irons. They claim that Louis Weichmann thought that she was suspicious and behaved suspiciously. And they claim that she must be guilty because she lied when she said she did not recognize Lewis Powell that night, April 17th. Certainly she knew John Wilkes Booth, the assassin of Abraham Lincoln. Booth befriended her. He used her. He was nice to her. Booth was a famous actor. She first met him in January 1865 when he called at the boarding house looking for John. Or in his absence, he would often ask for Louis Weichmann. Booth was there many times, but he usually asked for John, and if John wasn't there, he would ask for Mary. And he would ask Mary, "Where is John?" Booth was the kind of man that young girls longed for and fainted over, the kind of man whose presence was an excitement wherever he was, the kind of man whose picture would be purchased and held, just as Anna Surratt did. So while it's true that Mary knew John Wilkes Booth, Mary also knew many others. She knew George Atzerodt, who boarded with him. Can you imagine this fellow conspirator who she evicted from her boarding house because he had alcohol? Mary knew Lewis Powell, but she knew him as Reverend Wood, who stayed there as a Baptist preacher. Mary knew David Harold, who was a longtime acquaintance of her son, John Surratt. Mary's son, John, would stay at the boarding house at times, and also at the farm home at Surrattsville. He told his mother he was engaged in cotton speculation. Hence, she wasn't suspicious of John's activity or John's movements. But then Mary knew other people. Mary's knowledge of other people are innocent. It's innocent in nature, and it cannot support this claim of conspiracy. Now, Mary did go to Surrattsville on April 11th and April 14th. Both times, Louis Weichmann went with her. Mary told you, you heard her today, she shouldn't travel on these back roads at these times by herself, and she didn't. On Tuesday, Mary went to see John Nathie, who owed her money and had owed her money for a long time. The prosecutor says, well, what was so urgent all of a sudden? Well, it just so happened that on April 9th, Lee surrendered. And for all intents and purposes, the war was over. The hard times, the hard economic times were going to be over. People were going to be pressing for their debts. That's what Mary did with Dorothy. That's what George Calvert did with Mary. Mary was trying to survive in a man's world. Mary can own no property as a woman. All she can do is manage her husband's estate so that that property can be held by her sons. And Mary had been struggling to make ends meet. Mary tried to run the tavern by herself, but she failed. So she turned to John Lloyd. Now, the prosecutor would have you say that Lloyd was a drunk and that Mary couldn't turn to him. Well, just because he's a drunk doesn't mean he can't run a tavern. On that Friday, Mary did receive a letter from George Calvert. And I suppose in the prosecution's theory, George Calvert must be a conspirator too. How really unique it was that on the 12th of April, he happened to run into John Nathi and find out that Nathi was prepared to settle his debt, which in turn would allow the Calvert debt to be settled, and so he wrote a letter. Can you imagine Mary Surratt's shock when she received that letter on Friday morning? She was being pressed for the claim. You saw the letter. She would lose her land in Surrattsville. She would lose the fragile existence that was supporting her family. Of course it was urgent for her. And so, of course, even as a devout Catholic, she traveled on a holy day. But Nathi wasn't at Surrattsville, so she sent a note that was written by Louis Weichmann and waited and waited and waited, and Nathi didn't come. Mary's trips to Surrattsville were innocent. They were innocent in nature. They had nothing to do with this assassination. Now, Lloyd says that Mary mentioned to him shooting irons and whiskey. Shooting irons on Tuesday, shooting irons and whiskey on Friday. Isn't that interesting? Mary Surratt, who would kick George Atzerodt out of her boarding house, would talk about men having whiskey. It's so ridiculous it isn't worth commenting on. But Lloyd had guns. Lloyd had ammunition. Lloyd had a stretch of rope. Lloyd had a wrench. Lloyd had field glasses. He got all of those from John Surratt Jr., from George Atzerodt, from David Harold on March 15th, when their plan to kidnap the president failed. Mary told you she never said those things to John Lloyd. Whose version should be believed? Now, John Lloyd received the tools and guns and implements of a plot to kidnap the president. John Lloyd was present at Surrattsville when Booth and Harold came by, and he gave guns and ammunition and whiskey to those men. John Lloyd was an accomplice before, during, and after the murder of our president. John Lloyd was arrested. What is he to do? It's John Lloyd's life or death, or Mary Surratt's life or death. And John Lloyd told you that story. Judge Appleton will tell you that you can take into account the bias, interest, and prejudice of a witness who testifies. And in this instance, stop and think of the motive for John Lloyd to lie. And he did lie. But what about Mary? The prosecution says Mary is lying. But look at the circumstances of this case. There's not a shred of evidence that Mary had anything to do with this plot to kidnap the president. Would Booth really trust his crimes to a woman? No. But would Booth, Atzerodt, Powell, Harold, and other men have carbines, ropes, a monkey wrench, ammunition, and horses to kidnap the president? Of course they would. And they'd also need field glasses. Having that in mid-March makes perfect sense, and giving it to Lloyd for safekeeping makes perfect sense. The government wanted to prosecute a Surratt. They wanted John Surratt Jr., but they only have Mary. Mary, on the other hand, has told you the truth, and I submit her truth is supported by common sense. Now, Louis Weichmann told us that after this kidnapping plot, he saw John Surratt and Louis Payne on a bed with bowie knives and spurs. He went to his superiors in the War Department and told them that he suspected that there was something going on at the boarding house and that someone might be trying to kidnap the president. But you know what? He never said a word to Mary Surratt about what he had seen in that room. He never said a word to those military officials that he suspected Mary. He never said a word to Mary that he suspected her. And yet, on April 11th and April 14th, he drove her out to Surrattsville. Now, Weichman had a long and lasting relationship with John Surratt Jr., a college chum. Weichman had known David Harold since 1863 at Surrattsville. Weichman actually roomed with Lewis Powell, except it was Reverend Wood, and then saw him as Louis Payne later. Again, the change in identity, he never said a word to Mary Surratt. Weichman, just as Mary, knew all these men. All of them, George Surratt, David Harold, knew all of these men. And yet, Weichman is not a conspirator, but the government claims that Mary is. These witnesses, Weichman and Lloyd, are walking, talking, breathing reasonable doubt. Their testimony fades, and its accuracy is gone when you think about their motives to lie. Finally, Mary did not recognize Lewis Powell on April 17th. Brought to her in a dimly lit hallway, indeed, following her arrest, she asked the major if she could get down on her knees and pray. She raised from her knees and was taken to the door and asked if she knew this man, who claimed he was there to dig a ditch. She said, "Before God, I do not know this man." She knew Reverend Wood. She did not know this man. How could she recognize him? Poor light during the night, no spectacles. She needed him to be up close. And the man who had stayed at her before in the boarding house was dressed in a beautiful black coat and vest. He had a black mustache. He played the piano. He was charming. He wasn't this slug of human existence with a shirt sleeve on his head. Of course, Mary did not recognize him, and her truthful denial about Lewis Powell is also an innocent circumstance. This is not evidence of a conspiracy, and these are the sum total of the acts that they impute to Mary Surratt. You must decide the question in this case. Is Mary Surratt guilty of conspiracy? Is she guilty of murder? That question requires proof, evidence in this courtroom beyond a reasonable doubt. Mary Surratt has no burden of proof. You have presumed her innocent. Judge Appleton will tell you in the instructions that she remains innocent unless you are convinced beyond a reasonable doubt by proof. The charges against Mary are serious, but your duty as jurors is serious as well. You know, President Lincoln was from my home state of Illinois. He used to travel the circuit to my hometown in Urbana, where he would try cases in the courthouse. And Mr. Lincoln, as we knew him back then, would make his points by telling a story. And he would say, "That reminds me of the time." Well, the government's position in this case reminds me of the time that Mr. Lincoln told the story of the farmer who took his two boys to town to get supplies. James was the oldest, he was 11. John was the youngest, he was 9. They came back from town, and the boys were unloading the supplies when they noticed that the boar hog had escaped from the pen. And the boys said, "Pa, the hog has escaped." And Pa said, "Well, boys, go out there in the woods and get him and bring him back home." And so off the boys went, tracking the hog through the timber and the brush, out into the woods on this hot summer day. And pretty soon they came upon a clearing, and in the clearing there was a tree, and at the base of the tree there was that hog rooting. So the boys started whooping and hollering and yelling and charging the hog to get him to turn around and go back to the house. And to their surprise, the hog turned and charged at them. Well, James, the older boy, was a little wiser, and he shinnied up that tree. And he got up there and sat down on a branch, and he looked down, and what did he see in that clearing? He saw John holding on to that hog's tail, and that hog was going around and around and around the tree. And James hollered down, "John, are you all right? Are you all right?" And John said, "I think so, but could you come down here and help me let go?" The government wants John Surratt. John Surratt's name has been mentioned again and again in this evidence. Under the evidence, John was directly involved in that kidnapping attempt, but John was gone on April 14th, having left Washington, D.C. on April 3rd. Although the government doesn't have John Surratt, they have Mary Surratt. And the government wants you to help them let go. Not follow that burden of proof, but convict Mary because of the terror of our times. The spirit of Abraham Lincoln is here in this courtroom. It is a spirit of justice. Mr. Lincoln's spirit recognizes that burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Let Mr. Lincoln's spirit guide you. Restore Mary Surratt to her family. Find her not guilty. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the evidence and arguments have been completed, and I will now instruct you as to the law. It is your duty to determine the facts and to determine them only from the evidence in this case. You are to apply the law to the facts and in this way decide the case. Neither sympathy nor prejudice should influence you. The defendant is charged with conspiracy to commit first-degree murder of President Abraham Lincoln. A person commits the offense of conspiracy when she, with the intent that the offense of first-degree murder be committed, agrees with another to the commission of the offense of first-degree murder, and an act in furtherance of the agreement is committed by any party to the agreement. An agreement may be implied from the conduct of the parties, although they acted separately or by different means and did not come together or enter into an express agreement. To sustain a charge of conspiracy, the government must prove the following propositions. First, that the conspiracy as charged existed. Second, that the defendant knowingly became a member of the conspiracy with an intention to further the conspiracy. Third, that an overt act was committed by at least one conspirator in furtherance of the conspiracy. If you find from your consideration all the evidence that each of these propositions has been proven beyond a reasonable doubt, then you should find the defendant guilty. If, on the other hand, you find from your consideration of all the evidence that any of these propositions has not been proved beyond a reasonable doubt, then you should find the defendant not guilty. The defendant is presumed to be innocent of the charge against her. This presumption remains with her throughout every stage of the trial and during your deliberations on the verdict, and is not overcome unless from all the evidence in this case you are convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that she is guilty. The government has the burden of proving the guilt of the defendant beyond a reasonable doubt, and this burden remains on the government throughout the case. The defendant is not required to prove her innocence.
Ladies and gentlemen, you will now have 60 seconds in which to deliberate. I will inform you when those 60 seconds are up and when you may begin voting. Please begin your deliberations. Ladies and gentlemen, your 60 seconds are up. You now will have 30 seconds to render your vote. Please follow the instructions on your voting card and press 1A for guilty or 2B for not guilty. You may change your vote, but remember, your last vote is the one that counts. Your 30 seconds begin now.
The voting is now closed. I would ask the defendant to rise, and the verdict is
in reality, Mary Surratt was not granted a retrial. The military commission's sentence of death by hanging was carried out on July 7, 1865. Lewis Powell, George Surratt, and David Harold were also hanged that day. Frederick Aiken, Surratt's attorney, had obtained a writ of habeas corpus from a District of Columbia judge to delay the execution, but President Johnson suspended the writ. In April 1866, the United States Supreme Court decided the case of Lambden Milligan and established the rule that trial of civilians should take place in civilian courts, not military tribunals, when the court system is open and functioning. John Surratt Jr. was captured in Egypt and returned to the United States for trial. In June 1867, he was tried before a jury in a civil court. The jury deadlocked, and a mistrial was declared. He was never charged again, and John Surratt remained a free man until his death in 1916. The guilt of Mary Surratt and whether she should have received the death penalty is debated to this day.